Who are they? The Lost Boys. They're the children who fall out of their perambulators when the nurse is looking the other way. Oh, what fun it must be. Yes, but we are rather lonely. You see, we have no female companionship. Girls, you know, are much too clever to fall out of their prams.
So I was rereading the article that was written in, I think, the Wall Street Journal in 2016, September 1st. Nicholas Eberstadt, who's a political economist, and he wrote the book Men Without Work, America's Invisible Crisis, and he wrote an article called The Idle Army. And I think it's really interesting how post-World War II, one of the things that led to a baby boom and the rise of the American economy certainly is thousands and millions of men entering a workforce, either skilled or unskilled. And in no way is that the case now in terms of numbers.
Well, the male labor force participation rate is at or near its all-time low right now in 2020. And it's still very high. And it's calculated the top working age group, I think, is 18 to 54, something like that. And for most of America's history, as long as we have those statistics, it's like high 90s. And now I believe it's like mid 80s, mid to high 80s, which might not seem like a drastic drop, but it's a significant drop because we're talking about a population of more than 300 million people. So to have a further 10 or 12% drop out of the labor force is significant.
That's like what, 10 million people? It's millions and millions of men.
It's millions of men. And it's worth asking why they're doing that, what's changed. And a lot of it is structural. So like we just had COVID, for example, and COVID was the biggest economic hit since the 2008 recession. But one of the interesting things is the 2008 recession was, economists called it a Mancession because it was predominantly like construction jobs or long-haul trucking jobs that like men did. But COVID has been like a service industry, retail, all the schools have closed. So these are jobs that were predominantly done by women. I think maybe where I would like to start, if there's like a jumping off point to this, in 1960, the jobs that were most commonly done by men, like the 10 or 20 jobs that had the highest participation rate among men and the lowest participation rate among women, were things like construction and farming and fishing and agriculture. There's a whole list of them in the Bureau of Labor Statistics. And the jobs most commonly done by women were nursing, retail, secretarial work, primary school education. That hasn't changed in 50 years, in 70 years. That hasn't changed. Like the list of jobs that only men do and the list of jobs that basically only women do hasn't changed at all, which is really astonishing. Like no one talks about that. Like
I wonder why that might be.
Well, the other thing too is those.
What's the underlying secret?
Great question. And the glaring thing that stands out, particularly when you look at the women's jobs, the jobs that most women gravitate towards, or that are most dominated by women, I should say, they're jobs that involve dealing with people. They're jobs that involve helping people, catering to people.
High degrees of empathy and a social ability.
Yeah. I don't think just anyone can be a nurse. Like it's not just a matter of the skills it takes to be a nurse, which are like one level of prohibiting most people. But it's also like, can you interact with strangers in a caring manner for 10 hours a day, 8 hours a day? Most people can't do it.
It's funny. As I was reading in preparation for this talk, I read another article that did an interesting comparison to the men of Mad Men versus like the reality of most working class men in America in the 1960s.
Mm-hmm.
And it's actually it was a female writer, and I think for the New York Times. I'll link to it in the episode. But in 1960, about 25% of wives with children under 18 held jobs, many of them part-time, and a disproportionate number of those women came not from the middle class, but from the poorest fifth of American families. And so, like, she points to like how that was in her childhood. Like if your answer to what do you do wasn't I'm a housewife, it was I work. It was like this, it was pitiable.
Mm-hmm.
It was something to be considered, you know, oh, like your husband doesn't provide, or he's not providing enough.
And the men would have felt that shame, by the way. Christopher Hitchens, in a really famous interview, he was with a female interviewer, she mentioned some comment he made in an article, and she asked him point blank, like, do you not want your wife to work? And he said, oh no, she can work if she wants to, but she'll never have to. I don't ever want her to have to. And the interviewer got offended by this. That's a point of male pride. Like, it still is. It's so funny.
In Mad Men, obviously they're focusing on a very specific demographic and a specific type of man in a very specific industry.
Mad Men, which is an AMC television show.
Right.
Not everyone will know this.
Not everyone will know this. It aired in the, I think, mid 2000s, 2006, 2007
on AMC.
On AMC.
About
an advertising creative director who is not who he claims to be.
In the 1960s.
And it's set in 1960s America in New York City on Madison Avenue.
And a lot of the appeal to people was, oh my God, look at like what people believed back then. This typewriter is so easy, even a woman can use it.
Well, the misogyny and sexism is one aspect of
Well, I remember a scene also of them,
the show and what
them
they're
picnicking on this, like on the side of a highway and
then
just tossing
littering
their garbage. Yeah. The social attitudes that have changed.
But obviously the dynamic between Don Draper, who's the lead character, and his wife Betty is painful to watch unfold over the course of I think it was like 5-6 seasons. But it remains one of my favorite TV shows of all time.
And sorry, that dynamic is she's the golden handcuffs 60s housewife who maybe could have done things for herself because she's intelligent, but at the same time she's trapped in a marriage where he's having all the fun and she's stuck raising kids.
But she can't quite name her malaise because she's chosen this life. It's something she actively pursued and wanted and was raised to believe was...
Right. Maybe that's the question of choice, though, is how much...
Right. How much of a choice it was. So, but what's interesting in this, in contrast, in this article I was reading in the New York Times, she points out how she wished there would have been at least one scene where you showed a man waking up at 4:30 in the morning, having a cup of coffee to warm up his body, maybe reading a book because it's the only time of day he'll have a chance to do that, and getting into his car to drive an hour and a half to his 10-hour job to put food on the table and a roof over like the head of his family, 80 hours a week. That wasn't a reality that Mad Men as a series was trying to depict. But what's interesting to note is I think men today are still... You know, we judge the corner office men of Wall Street and anyone in business by the same kind of terrible standards as we did back then. Like somehow those men are all men. Those high-paying, high-powered men who make all the money and make all the decisions represent all men in the workforce in a weird way.
And somehow Don Draper became an avatar of 60s masculinity in general.
Right. Well, what's interesting about Don, and this is like... So he's surrounded by a cohort of men who grew up in Americana elitism in the 30s and 40s and were a part of all the right clubs and went to all the right elite schools, private prep schools, all those things. East Coast elite is how like his colleagues are defined. And he actually came from nothing, middle America, fought in a Korean War, worked various labor jobs, and lied his way to the top. And while many aspects of his character are irredeemable, the fact that he remains the most manly figure of all of them has way more to do with where he came from than the society like he finds himself in as a creative director. I think that's an interesting little caveat. But looking at a show that's set in the 60s and that kind of, you know, most of the housewives are pitiable. Most of their circumstances, you know, their husbands are cheating on them. They have no agency for the most part. They're forced to raise these kids and hire nannies, and they have, you know, existential malaise all the time. And yet...
Did we get rid of existential malaise? I didn't get that memo.
No, we haven't. In fact, we've only made it worse. But I think it's still interesting to note and that a man providing for his family is still something that's overwhelmingly true when I watch that series. Like there's a sense of duty and obligation to go to work and earn a living all of those men, especially like, when they start having babies in like the second and third seasons, like the younger people in the office, there's this sense of like, okay, well, I have a baby on the way. Like I have to ask for a raise and I have to, start working more hours. And honey, I'm really sorry. I have to work this weekend. And part of the time it's like, okay, well, no, you don't. You're just fooling around with your friends. But a lot of the time it's no. I have to generate income.
And they take on the stress of all of that too, like the mortgage and
getting the kid into the right school.
One of my all-time favorite Simpsons episodes, which is I think in the first season, is Homer at the power plant. He's the only one working. Homer works at a nuclear power plant, and I think it's announced that year that there will be no Christmas bonuses, and he was relying on the Christmas bonus to buy presents for his children. And the whole episode is just about like how much of a failure he feels because he's not gonna be able to give his kids Christmas presents. And like, shit, that's a way more accurate depiction of the average American and certainly the average American male going back 100 or 200 years than Don Draper giving out, like, I don't know, fur coats to whichever women he's sleeping with that week. There's a great Drake line that now makes me think of Don Draper about giving out Chanel like a hug.
You just quoted Drake. I'm so impressed.
Yeah. But that's why Homer's a noble character, even though he's a buffoon. That's why he's a good father, like because he does care and because he does like he is willing to work a job he hates.
And why his wife Marge ultimately stays with him, because despite his visible shortcomings, he's a loving partner who cares about his family first and foremost.
Yeah.
And providing for her gives him a raison d'être.
I'm going to stick another Simpsons anecdote. Sorry, I could do this all day. There's an episode where he gets the chance to pursue his dreams. I don't even remember what those dreams were in that episode. So he quits his job. I think he's working at a bowling alley. But then all of a sudden he finds out he's having another kid, and the bowling alley income is not going to cut it. And he has to kind of go back on his hands and knees to the nuclear power plant. And the boss, who's an asshole, Monty Burns, makes him kind of eat shit for that and says, you're going to eat shit for the rest of your time here. And he puts up a picture of his daughter, of Maggie, his youngest. And that's how he looks at that every day. And that's how he'll eat shit. That's how he'll survive eating shit and paying for his family. And that was 90s America. Like, that was not controversial that men did that and were noble for doing that in 90s America. It's not that long ago.
That's funny. I mean, like, I guess we're flipping through our Rolodex of favorite American TV shows. But another one I loved, and it was actually also in the mid-2000s, or 2010s, was Breaking Bad. That pilot episode is grained in my mind. Like, Walter White is a chemistry teacher who in the very first episode of Breaking Bad finds out that he's diagnosed with terminal cancer. And prior to that moment, we're in the first 20 minutes of the episode, we're basically taken through his daily routine, which consists of working full-time as a teacher. His students don't respect him very much, even though he's brilliant. We learn a little bit more about how he was screwed over in the past by an asshole macho male figure who ultimately had more confidence to steal his idea and make it into a business, ability he didn't have. And then we watch him go to a car wash and work a second shift to support his family. He has a son with cerebral palsy, a wife. I don't think she works, but she's pregnant. And I think he receives like a kind of passive hand job for his birthday that night at the end of the first episode.
Really sad scene.
Really sad, devastating first episode. But once
she's reading something.
As she's reading and
like
giving
bills,
him,
the bills.
She's paying the bills while giving him a hand job, not even looking at him and saying like, then she's like, happy birthday.
Passion.
And he's all the while,
dealing with the cancer diagnosis.
And I would also say, like, there's no moment in that first episode or in the first 10 where he explodes and he breaks bad and starts selling meth, but he doesn't ever complain about his circumstances to his family. He doesn't lash out at his wife. He doesn't complain that she's not giving him enough. He doesn't, you understand that up until the point where he realizes he has cancer and he's wasting the time he has left, he's been doing this for years.
Mm-hmm.
And there's something so noble about that. Even Tony Soprano, for me, is like another figure.
One of the things that very much irks me when I hear young people describe history, because they've never read history. They've had history through theory, basically. And they talk about like male privilege historically and women's oppression historically. And they have no context whatsoever for like most people subsisted on like farms. Like it was like you had a plot of land, and if you were going to eat, it was because you worked that land for whatever food you could. And that is the most backbreaking goddamn labor you can do. Like it's just unreal that like all of our ancestors for centuries did that just to survive. Like you think it was I think there was like it wasn't like convenience. It wasn't who's getting one up on the other person. It was like, this is what we need to do to survive. Otherwise, there's literally no food on the table. And when you look like historians have tried to like calculate how many calories were in the average diet, like they're starvation diets by our standards, absolutely starvation diets. But it's what you could wring from the land. And to like reconfigure all of human history so that to erase that sacrifice, to say what they were really doing was gathering power for themselves. That's a rhetorical move that like conceals a devastating little political.
I think it's once again like throwing everything out with the bathwater, in the sense that we've removed all context for every single circumstance in which people currently might define patriarchy as being an oppressor.
But even the people who want to put in some context, like you'd have to be a very, very competent historian to supply even half of it. Like what are the contexts that kept women in a domestic role? Well, one of them is like your children weren't all going to survive past 5. And in fact, a lot of them are going to die in childbirth. So like if you were just going to have children, if we were going to have like a future of the village or a future of the tribe, you were probably going to try to get like 8 to 10 in your lifetime, and maybe 3 or 4 or 5 survive. Like a reality of life, not even like 3 or 4 centuries ago, was you were going to bury a lot of your kids before they turned 5. Like that was a common thing. Like the graveyards of centuries ago are filled with like
little kids.
To
which a modern feminist might reply, well, women were having too many kids to begin with and forced to have them. Well,
it's just a matter of if the kid dies and you don't have a second, then there's just no there's no future for your civilization or your tribe. And let's even be more practical. If you work on a farm, the father cannot do that in his 40s, 50s, and 60s. That type of labor breaks you. So you need a son. You need people to work the farm with you. We are so fortunate to have escaped that, because there are still countries that live in exactly this kind of dynamic. It's what do they call it? A Malthusian trap. You make enough money to have more children, but now you have more mouths to feed. We broke that. We were so fortunate to break that, and all of the moral progress that we've made and that we're so quick to defend depends on our having broken that. But that took centuries.
Well, we have no concept of evolutionary progress in relation to our moral progress, and we judge the past through the lens of our contemporary theories,
right?
As opposed to, like you said, any real kind of learning on history and or any lived experience that might actually allow you to relate to the circumstances of people who have to work on a farm.
Yeah.
But it's interesting, though, because this could lead into an interesting discussion. I mean, I think it's important to note I'm very content that we earn the right to vote as women, and I am very content that I earn the right to an education. And I would not take those back. I think it took us a little too long. We know that the most successful democratic societies involve female education and the right to vote. This being said, you would think that we are now reached, I think, where women have reached the highest levels of education, are more economically independent than their ancestors ever were, and their mothers and grandmothers. And you would think that would mean that when choosing a partner, they'd be willing to quote unquote marry down. You would think.
No, that was explicitly a theory, by the way. That was advanced by feminists.
Was it really?
Advanced by feminists in the 1960s, saying we're going to take some of the economic burden off men. That's really how they phrased it. You won't have to be the sole breadwinners anymore.
Oh,
Won't that
I
be
didn't
great?
know that.
It's so astonishing, because now they don't even acknowledge that was ever a burden for men. Now it was just all oppression. But that really was something that.
So they actually said hypergamy would fade.
They didn't use that expression, but they said that.
No, but
if they'd believed in it, they would never have been able to say that it would fade. What they said was, we will help remove the economic strain on men by allowing us to work. And by the way, this has worked extremely well for like the upper decile of society, let's say. Like there is still, and you and I know all these people, there are women who are doctors or psychologists, who marry engineers or who marry other doctors or surgeons, and they're power couples. They end up with two really high earning people, and they can afford a massive mortgage, so they live in massive homes. And they've created all across America and all across Canada, they've created little enclaves where really wealthy, really well-educated couples live. And it may as well be a separate country from the rest of America or the rest of Canada. That's been happening ever since the 1960s.
Before you partner up with someone long-term or marriage, in the dating circles, in dating dynamics, with all of their theories and all of their education, young women who want to educate men on what it means to be a feminist, and while also telling them that, they're the root of all evil in terms of their patriarchal oppression, the preference is still overwhelming, and the research is there to back it, that women will choose a partner that earns more money than them. That's an appealing factor.
Equivalent money or above. Yeah.
Or above.
Yeah. And same with education.
But you would think, it's so funny to me, because you would think that with all the desire to be part of the workforce and build a career, that a woman might choose someone who doesn't have the similar desires. So at least one person can take maybe more responsibility for child rearing. Like, if that's I think, like, to me, that's what I understand to be a lot of the time the ultimate feminist goal. If you're a heterosexual female and you want a partner, like, in an ideal world, you have a stay-at-home dad. And yet, I think it's so interesting that the data is showing that that's not necessarily the case at all.
Well, even very wealthy women who could afford to have a stay-at-home dad still tend to, when they are asked about their preferences, they want men who are as high achieving as them or below or above. And again, I just mentioned that at the high ends, this creates power couples and really wealthy zip codes that are kind of orders of magnitude above the average household income for the country, which is its own political nightmare, because those people end up with a lot of power, even though they're a minority of people in the total country. But on the flip side of the scale, you have at the bottom of the economic and socioeconomic ladder, you have men who cannot marry because they're not marriageable, and you have women who can't find a husband. So either they don't have children, or more likely they have children out of wedlock, and you end up with broken homes, and you end up with the pathology of neighborhoods where you don't get two parents investing in a child. And that's another reality that we've magnified dramatically since 1960. There's a great book.
And another reason why men aren't participating in the workforce.
Well, if you don't give them,
if they don't have a father figure to mirror for them what it means to earn a living.
Or, well, not only that, but men increase their income in response to their wife having children. Like, fathers work harder than single men. And if you create a lot of single men, especially in an era where, like, God, for like a few $100 you can play video games for a year, like, that's what they're going to do. Andrew Yang, it's so funny, I meant to mention this. Before he was a presidential candidate, I think he even wrote a book on this subject, but he certainly wrote a few essays about men in video games and men dropping out.
Oh yeah, I read his one on the video game. Yeah, the escapism.
Yeah.
We'll get into that.
Well, we've decreased the cost of not having a job. We've increased the cost of marriage, and we've made leisure time democratically available. We've lowered the cost of super entertaining games. So of course it's going to happen. Why wouldn't it happen?
And who can afford a house?
Yeah. But I only wanted to point out, and the credit for all of this goes to Charles Murray, who wrote a book called Coming Apart, which describes the class stratification in America post-1960. And at one end of that is those super high-end, high-earner, high-educated couples who can afford massive mortgages and who end up living in really, really select zip codes. Really select zip codes, like 3 or 4 on the East Coast, 3 or 4 on the West Coast, like 1 or 2 in the interior. That's it. But the flip side of that is social breakdown in poorer neighborhoods. And one of the saddest things, I think this is from Coming Apart, he discusses a movie, A Christmas Story, I believe, that came out in 1960. And it takes place in like what would have been average poor American town. But average poor American town still looked like average rich American town in its family structures. Like, there were still 2 parents, and there was going to be a Christmas tree, and it might not have been good presents under the tree, but like, you had the experience of Christmas, and you had the experience of a father putting on the Santa Claus. And he says by the mid and late 2000s, all of a sudden the wealthy areas still look like that. The wealthy areas still look like two parents and the Christmas tree, but the poor areas, no more two parents. Father absence is the norm now. And that's devastating for America for so many reasons. The knock-on consequences.
Would you say in what you've read, like that's true mostly for Christians? Christian America?
Well, America being predominantly Christian and this coinciding with a collapse in Christianity and the collapse in church attendance. Yes. Yeah.
Another podcast in and of itself.
Right. But so the funny thing is the wealthy areas tend to be secular, but they don't live as if they're like, they live according to the life script of the 1950s, let's say. Like they really do. Like they might
while denying any of the values,
or just while not preaching that life script is the easiest thing to say. Like they preach, do whatever you want, but among themselves they live with this code. I'm gonna bring in. I had a funny moment talking to our cousin, our aunt and uncle who live in one of these wealthier zip codes and have fellow
in the States,
and they were describing to me like. I think their daughter posted a photo or someone posted a photo of their daughter smoking a chocolate cigarette, but it looked like a real cigarette. And they had like a flurry of text messages like the next day from concerned friends of theirs, concerned parents saying, "Oh my God, is your daughter smoking? Is our daughter smoking?" Like freaking out about this. It's so amusing. Like, I mean, on the one hand, you're like I can kind of understand the concern, but on the other hand, you're like, my God, like you're so hyper focused. Like, but at the lower end of the socioeconomic ladder, like there's nothing like that. Like, it's not like, oh my God, my daughter tried a cigarette. It's like my daughter's like not graduating from school, or my son has dropped out, or like the amount of social energy that goes into rearing children at the high end is probably higher than it's ever been because there's fewer children. So there's more time and attention to focus on those few children. But all of this, I wanted to talk about why that small dip, and it's not a small dip, but I guess it might appear to be a small dip in male labor force participation, can precipitate a lot of these changes, and why people wouldn't intuit that that's the case. One of the things that economists, bad economists, which might be most economists, do is they treat people as if they're interchangeable. And an economist like that is surprised to find that there's a relationship between a man's income and his marriage rates, and no relationship between a woman's income and her marriage rates. Low-income women can still get married. Low-income men cannot. So what happens when you have this decline in male labor force participation is it's a concomitant rise in the value of the marriageable men. It's like, oh, there are fewer of you. And if there's fewer of something, its value goes up. And so all of a sudden, those men have more, let's say, bargaining power. And one of the things that happens when men have bargaining power is they kind of dictate terms. Like the very wealthy men, and the best example of this is still Hollywood or professional athletes. Like that's kind of how they would live their lives, like playboys for 30 or 40 years, and then they'll settle down. So that puts women in a funny bind too. But that's a result of a decline in men who can compete with them, because all of a sudden the women are forced to choose between fewer men. And those men have leverage that they didn't have before. Another great example of this comes from college campuses and the studying of hookup culture. They found that colleges where the gender ratio on campus is more egalitarian, closer to 50-50, there's less of a hookup culture. There's like more dating going on. Whereas the more skewed it is towards women, there's more of a hookup culture. And that confused people because they thought, well, if women's preferences aren't for hooking up, why, when there are more women, is there more of a hookup culture? Well, the answer is because there's fewer men who are attractive, and those men get comparatively more social power.
Why do you think it's so invisible, this issue, if it's so predominant? And
because we get to clap our hands and say we're making a more equal world.
So you think
that's part of the pathology of the American upper class and the intelligentsia is that they're all sold on this. They all think 50-50 is better, or closer to 50-50.
And I wonder who's reinforcing the selling of college campuses.
Oh yeah, of course.
The intellectual elite.
No, that's my point. They're
and now mainstream media.
It's been that way for a while.
But I don't think it's been that. Yes, it has been that way for a while. The very insidious thing about this, and I myself felt the same way as a college student, it's presented as absolute fact.
What's presented as absolute fact?
That equality of outcome is more important than equality of opportunity.
When they have no framework.
And that phrasing manifests itself in different areas, gender wars being one of them.
Mm-hmm. They have no paradigm whatsoever for why people should be regarded as different, why they might make different choices. It's actually, in a way, it's admirable and intellectually consistent. It just happens to be wrong. But their position is there really is no difference between men and women. They're more or less interchangeable. And so the fewer women in any area, the worse, and the more women in that area, the better. And we're gonna tilt the scales however we can to get more women into those positions.
Okay, well,
and that's great for, there are some, let's say this too, there are some career-driven women, plenty deserve their wonderful careers, but plenty also play this game really cynically and say, like, you don't have enough women here and I'm a woman candidate, hire me. Like, that happens. What, men would do the same thing? People tend to.
Yeah, but I still, and to this day, there are jobs that I've received, especially in the film and television industry, where I'm so hyper aware that I'm filling a quota that not only
do they have quotas though?
Everything has an unwritten quota now. So you never actually know if you've earned the position on your own merit. And that to me is more haunting than anything else. There is no freedom in that. There is no agency in that. And the condescension is mammoth. And that's why I can't quite comprehend. I mean, we're currently witnessing right now what's going on with the Black Lives Matter movement. Whatever your opinion is on that, but there have been many moments and instances where I've seen white people express the most condescending things
about Black people,
about what we should do for Black people.
Mm-hmm. And
it's the Black intellects that I follow on Twitter who are able to point out how condescending that sounds. And the same is true for, if you're a female being hired to fulfill a quota, sure, you're going to benefit from it. But
But I'm only saying that there are people who are so cynical and so self-interested that if they can play this game to their personal advantage, they will do that.
And many people do. I think most people do.
Well, I think men would do the exact same thing. I think it's why
that's why they're interchangeable. Humanity. But then I think we should enter into some tricky territory now, because
it's been so untricky before this.
The mother of all minefields you presented to me a few years ago, we were having an email exchange with a friend of ours.
Mm-hmm. Really?
And you pointed out, you brought up what Jordan Peterson pointed out, that 90% of men have jobs and not careers. And that's been true arguably since time immemorial. Like, your job is to feed and house and provide for your family. A few select people in society get to have careers that are actually meaningful and rewarding and contribute to a larger cause and extend past their lifetime. Mm-hmm. I think it's great to aspire to, but I think it's interesting that if you won $1 million, you pose the question, if you won $100 million tonight, would you go to work tomorrow? If you answer no to that, you clearly have a job and not a career right off the bat, right? Like, I think that's an easy way to rule out the fact that you don't have a career. So if that is true for most men and has been true for most men, it's certainly now true for most women. Because as women have entered into the labor force and get jobs, those who aren't pursuing, law and professional degrees or medicine or anything that might lead them to a long-term, high-paying career, most people have jobs, women and men.
Well,
and most people hate their jobs.
Yeah, there's
most people hate going to work.
Yeah. It's a funny little bourgeois mindset that says the job is a source of fulfillment. It's the type of people who are like tenured college professors, where they work 9 months a year and have a pension and have paid vacation, and they're working in air-conditioned offices in the summer and heated offices in the winter, and they're doing something that they find fulfilling and then they're passionate about. That's wonderful. That's just not most people, and it could never and probably will never be most people.
The trade-off for men, as you pointed out, as Jordan Peterson pointed out, was being able to provide for a family. And you asked me, and I had such a hard time answering it. And I remember how angry it made me initially to even think about it. But you said, what's the payoff for women? What does it give women to have a job? What's the trade-off for them? What does it bring to their lives? in most cases, women have to choose between work and having babies, or make a sacrifice in their career that's substantial to have children. Pausing becoming a lawyer or partner in a firm is really not ideal, and it happens just at the time where women's fertility is either peaking and or declining. Same thing true for being a doctor, I would imagine. But what's so difficult to wrap your head around that, I think, from at least my female perspective, is as a woman, your whole life, if you grew up a millennial woman, you're told the world is not only your oyster, but girl power, and you can have whatever job you want. And that is the thing that is going to help you define who you are. And lo and behold, well, most people don't get the satisfaction of a meaningful career. So not only are women not having the trade-off providing for a family, they're dating late into their 20s, early 30s, finding themselves single, providing for themselves, and maybe, yes, accumulating their own wealth and deciding what they want to do with their lives. But at the end of the day, it's no wonder that women ultimately still have as a standard men who are equal or higher earning than they are when it comes to partnering, because they don't want to have to provide for themselves when they have kids. There's also plenty of research to back that. And now you have a lot of women expressing huge levels of dissatisfaction and depression because they're working those 70, 80-hour weeks and finding that there's actually no reward.
It doesn't even have to be that they don't want to have to provide for someone. It could just be that they don't want the burden of having a man who can't provide at exactly the moment when they're most vulnerable, when they're pregnant and then saddled with
which
really
stands
young
to
children,
reason.
which is eminently reasonable.
Eminently reasonable.
Yeah.
But it's so funny because on the notion of treating men and women in the workplace as interchangeable, the societal repercussions of that, it's not that I don't think necessarily that we're ignoring it. I think we're so blind to those repercussions. We're experiencing them without knowing how to name them. We're experiencing what's happening without actually being able to identify the source, the root cause of the problem. To add to that, I'm going to read back to you the question that you emailed us.
When was this?
I think this was like in 2016.
Okay.
If you were the Grand Commissioner of Women, would it be worth it to you to close this confidence gap and have equal representation of women in the upper echelons of government and business, if that meant equal representation of women in prisons, juvenile detention facilities, on the streets, and in backbreaking labor? I don't know.
I don't know that any human being can. I'm very skeptical of people who think they can survey all of society and tell me who has it easier. Like in certain cases,
But that's not really the question.
Would you exchange positions?
Having no direct experience in anything remotely close to backbreaking labor, I can also say by, direct observation in my micro society, the people who build the roads and clean the windows of my building and construct the buildings and pick up the garbage for the most part and do all of the things that actually make my city function and in my immediate community run well are men.
Well, all of our modern freedom is very much contingent on an infrastructure that is built and maintained by men.
Right. So
I whispered that part.
You did. You really did. But our physical environment that I need to live and navigate my world and my community. So who has it harder is not really the more interesting question. It's also who has the ability. If we swapped all of those men out and put in women, would our roads be as well built? Would the buildings be well constructed? Would the physical labor be possible? Probably, if we hired many more women to do the job to equal the strength of the men that it's required to do those jobs. And deeper than that, if you're on the side of believing that those are patriarchal structures that were formed strictly to be male-only environments, then why do you see the occasional female garbage collector or the occasional female construction worker? And chances are, if you walk by a construction site, the female construction worker is holding up the sign and navigating things. She's not doing any of the lifting. She's not doing any of she's not on the top of the building. what would you have to acknowledge about our biology and our differences that are not interchangeable? And would it be worth it to you anyway to make sure it's equal?
But even not even going that far, just saying, if you can acknowledge that the fact that you have a career and can pursue an education, and that your career doesn't involve backbreaking physical labor, all of that's built on an infrastructure that predated your existence. And like, maybe instead of being perpetually resentful about the past and describing everything as oppressive, maybe it's worth taking at least a moment to say, like, my God, like, at least I don't have to do that. At least I was spared that. Like, something was set up in such a way that I could spend the first 25, maybe even 30 years of my life studying. That's by the standards of human history, that's just so ludicrous. It's so unlikely. Like, life expectancy not so long ago for like human beings was like 36. And now we have people who are in school until they're 30. That's incredible. That's just a level of development that was unimaginable to most of your ancestors. And all we seem to want to do now, and especially the best educated and most affluent among us, is be resentful and bitter and discard that sacrifice.
So the reason I went as far as I did is to negate the biological factor is to miss the forest for the trees. You're
saying that
you're analyzing the gender gap through the lens of the highest achievers, and most of those high achievers are men, and we're pointing to those men, and we're saying that that's the patriarchy. But the pyramid of men is huge, and men in the workforce is huge, and the upper echelons are not the standards through which you should be analyzing anything when it comes to why there are different workforce participation rates between men and women, and why there are wage gaps, and why high percentage of men are in very specific fields and high percent of women are in other fields. I think what irks me the most is there's no recognition that the competitiveness and the risk taking and the biological factors that motivate men to choose the jobs they do not inherently exist in women for the most part. And you just pausing there, like, there's no moment where we're actually trying to, like, there's no moment to consider that. There's never a pause of like, oh, perhaps there is this difference because we've denied that biological sex is a thing, but also that there are biological factors at play unbeknownst to you at all times.
I can give an example of this that might make what you're trying to say more concrete. One of the data we've pulled from dating apps and dating websites is the impact that a candidate's earnings has on how many matches they get or how many responses they get. And for men, it's a very, very significant impact. Like, if they list their career as lawyer or doctor, their matches go up versus if their career is like, I don't know, waiter. And it's not the case for women. And most men have never seen any data like this, but most men by the time they're 25 know that this is true. They know that there's some relationship between how they're succeeding in life and how they're succeeding with women. And for women, which is both a positive and a negative, there's no such relationship. If you're an attractive woman, it doesn't matter if you're unemployed and living at home or if you're, I don't know, a CEO, men will be attracted to you. And if you're an unattractive woman, if you're overweight and you don't take care of yourself, if you're a CEO, you're not helping your chances with men. Men don't care. And that's how is that not going to drive people's behavior? Like, if men find out that there's almost no limit to the advantages they get from making more money, why wouldn't they why wouldn't they make more money? Why wouldn't they work 60, 70 hours a week? Why wouldn't finance be dominated by frat bros from college? They figured it out. They absolutely figured it out. They're acting on the same basic impulse that said to them, if I'm on the football team and I join the frat, my chances are better. The same thing motivates them to do 60 hours a week on Wall Street or 70 hours a week on Wall Street.
So what's the functional equivalent in a female, in a woman, to that person? What's that?
There isn't. What I'm saying is there isn't one.
But no,
there's diminishing returns for
right, not in the workforce. But what
makes them more attractive?
Yeah.
Oh, they know that too. I don't need to tell them. Look at how much time they spend doing their hair and makeup and getting the perfect selfie. They know that. Women are way smarter than sociologists and the academic people opining on all of this. They know how to navigate their world, and men know how to navigate theirs, more or less. It's just, you're not allowed to say these things.
that does concretize my point, but I also think it's...
Well, you might also say, if you're a woman and you're innately attractive to men, even if you're poor, why would you work Uber? Why would you ride a taxi? Why would you join why not parlay your youth and beauty into dating someone who can take care of you but better, who can provide a better life for you? That happens. That's a game people play. And why shouldn't they? But the men on the bottom end of the socioeconomic spectrum who are being told that they're
the equivalent of the upper echelons is really staggering to me.
They're livid, and they should be livid. Like, they're being told how easy they have it by people who work with their minds, and these people overwhelmingly work with their bodies. And no matter whether you're male or female, trust me, you want to work with your mind, not your body.
Well, so getting back to a point that Nicholas Eberstadt made in Men Without Work, America's Invisible Crisis, I'm quoting him here. Until roughly the outbreak of World War II, working-age American men fell into basically two categories, either holding a paid job or unemployed. There was no third way for able-bodied males. Today there is one, neither working nor seeking work. That is, men who are outside the labor force altogether.
Mm.
The no-work life hardly consigns these men to destitution in America.
There's a whole category. They're so common now that there's a whole category. They call them NEETs.
Yeah, I was just going to say that I had never heard that before, but neither employed nor in education or training.
There you go.
It's a British phrase.
Yeah,
NEET.
The NEETs. And there are a lot of men.
Socializing, relaxing, and leisure is a full-time occupation for accounting for 3,000 hours a year.
Yeah. Yeah.
And we know, but that's in front of a computer screen for the most part.
Or like recreational sports are huge for men.
But for men who aren't necessarily into sports.
Even men who don't play sports love fantasy football. Fantasy football is huge. People make that like a part-time job. I kid you not. Like, they'll work a 30-hour or 35-hour work week, and they'll do another 15 hours of listening to fantasy football podcasts, betting, setting your lineups, playing multiple teams.
And also the highest number of single men living off welfare is really interesting. Basically disabled men.
So, I don't know what data you're looking at, but we have fewer men working backbreaking jobs, but more men claiming disabilities now. And I don't know why. I mean, the suggestion is that there are people claiming and getting disabilities who don't really have disabilities, or who are broadening the phrase disability beyond all normative meaning. But it's enough to talk about the guys who are kind of just coasting, because there's a lot of guys just coasting.
Who have jobs that are that provide their lifestyle.
They're perfectly happy in a dead end job that they don't hate doing, that they only have to do for a few hours a week,
so that they can enjoy the leisure activities.
Yep. And there's in the restaurant industry in Montreal, like, there's so many men in their 30s who are
and all over North America.
And all over. I mean, I'm speaking from what I know, but yeah.
And then the dissatisfaction expressed by the single woman who's wondering, like, oh, he has no ambition, or
well, they don't have to.
He has no 5-year plan.
That's hidden from them too,
to a certain extent.
Well, I think most of them, it's totally hidden from them until they decide that they're at that stage in their life where they want to take things to a new level, and
which is already too late.
Well, it's harder. It's certainly harder. The later you find out, the harder it is. But that's when they look around and say, "Oh crap! Like, I thought I had all this freedom. I was told I had all this freedom, and I have the freedom, but now I made a different choice. Now my choice is like to settle down."
And they expect society to come and meet them where they are.
Right.
They expect the men to come and meet them where they are.
Yeah, and they don't, and they aren't.
By the way, it's so ironic though that, like, oh, we're so interchangeable up until the point where it comes to family formation, and then suddenly you realize that most of the men in your life, or that you could possibly meet on your dating apps, don't actually want the same things that you do,
or on the same timeline that you want it.
Right. Yeah. Or aren't even thinking about a timeline,
or haven't been, and don't have a savings account, and don't have a job to afford it.
There is no foundation,
and don't want a mortgage, and don't have good credit.
But I can't think of any more perfect example of how men and women, young men and women, are so vastly different when it comes to that moment, that biological clock moment.
Mm-hmm. No, I give you, I'm sorry, but I have a better, you're not wrong. That's the best example maybe. But to me, I still don't understand, like, the women who throw themselves so headfirst into education and career are more incomprehensible to me than the men who say, I'm just going to, I'm going to pursue what I love. And
I know, but I have such a hard time when I hear you say that. I really, really do.
I fully understand. Maybe it's because I am a man, but I've worked an office job, and it was like it's the most soul crushing.
But
thing.
when you say you can't understand why women would pursue education,
no. I said throw themselves headlong.
Right, but
it's like if you're doing it because you want this job and you want to be able to provide for a family, and you have that whole thing like scheduled, and you know that those are the steps you need to hit, then it's comprehensible to me. But if it's just you're told to do this and you're doing it, the intrinsic pleasure to me, particularly of the job, because most people don't have a great, like, fulfilling job, I just don't get it.
Well, I don't know. I'd like to, maybe this is far past idealism at this point, but and I don't have any faith left in universities anyway, but my pursuit of a bachelor degree in English literature, however useless that was, and I ended up dropping out of it, wasn't because I had a 5-year plan and I knew what I was going to do next.
No, of course.
It was because I grew up reading and loving
literature. But it might also be, sorry to like interject, I think it also could be and is that women get to take for granted in their early years that they are attractive and worthy mates to men. And so that part's actually fun for them. Like that's maybe half of life right there. And it's like, it comes.
That's a minefield thing to say.
Well, but it's, as far as I can tell, it's true.
I'm not denying its veracity. I just...
No, but
there's something painful about that.
It's commonly said, even by feminists, and they're right to say this, that at puberty, men don't get hit on by women who are in their 20s.
No, of course not.
But women do, who develop breasts all of a sudden, notice that men are staring at them.
Yeah,
that's a massive difference.
And I'm sure it's a source of joy and excitement for a lot of people.
Pain. And I don't mean to say that. I'm not saying it's a...
No, I'm not trying to minimize what you're saying. I'm just saying, I think when you say 50% of...
I was only saying, if you get on a dating app as a 20-year-old woman, you have a confirmation, literally, like a lot of them say that they don't even want to date. They just want the kind of ego boost of knowing they get matches. They get the matches. Like there's nothing they have to figure out. There's no like, it's not something they really have to earn. It's just something that they're kind of born into through puberty and through how male sexual desire works. So that whole area of life
is... And even there's a hierarchy, right? Like...
Of course.
Right.
And I'm not suggesting...
Good genetics versus not.
Nothing of what I just said means it's not horribly difficult for them to navigate, and of course. But that's a massive difference. And the men, especially the men who like... Men can get the signals pretty strongly that they're just not like... If you're a 20-year-old male and you're socially awkward and unattractive, like it might even just be entirely a waste of time for a long time. or the psychic trauma of being rejected as often as you're probably going to be rejected makes it less worthwhile. And if that's the case, then you're not necessarily going to maybe you'll find other passions, and men do that. They like pour themselves into video games because it becomes a passion. It becomes like, oh, nothing else in my life suits me or opens up to me or gives me this sense of purpose and meaning and a kind of a progression forward. I'll throw myself into the video game. Some men throw themselves into music or reading or whatever. But I'm just saying it's not likely that they're going to work a job they don't like. They're not going to like, for the sake of building.
But they don't know that yet. So when you say you can't understand why a woman would throw herself headlong into something like it.
You're saying the women don't know that?
Yeah.
No, I know they don't.
I don't think anyone really knows that until they enter the workforce, which is part of the struggle and reality of, I think, growing up.
Mm-hmm.
I think we all have a moment where we realize what we thought we would be doing with our lives isn't matching with the reality of what we ended up doing or choosing, or didn't have a choice. But there is no 5-year, 10-year plan. We've already agreed on this. Like there is no 5-year, 10-year plan for most young people in terms of how they view their own lives. We have plenty of hashtags to solidify that notion, YOLO being one of them. FOMO, like all these things are reinforcing that every decision that you're making is the most important, that it satisfies you in the moment. Compounded by the fact that I think maybe I think it's still so new in our culture that women have access to an education. There's still something very exciting about it.
I don't know that I agree that women do. I mean, you tell me, but
What do you mean you don't agree with which part?
Like most people having access to education is super rare. Like higher education was not accessible to most people 70 years ago. It's not that long ago. Like, yeah, there were men in higher education, but most people didn't do higher education.
But men weren't barred from
and
higher education.
And in fact, there are still more people without college degrees in America than with college degrees.
Right, but men weren't barred from having access to being educated and choosing a career or choosing anything that wasn't necessarily domestic.
But does that consciousness carry over to every other generation coming down?
Well, that's what I'm wondering. I'm wondering about. I mean, certainly the female consciousness has changed in relation to dating in other areas of their lives rather dramatically. My whole perspective is that it really hasn't, and that they're. But if we take it back to the example of Betty Draper in Mad Men, she had the 10-year plan. She went to her little college. She came out,
which is basically a finishing school,
which is what they were for women at the time.
The Mrs. degree.
Yeah, the Mrs. degree. Betty Draper represents the woman who had a 10-year plan and was groomed and conditioned to believe that her best quality of life was through marriage and having kids and doing it young and living in the suburbs. And that, I think that quality of life could have been very satisfying and probably was satisfying for many women. But in terms of like that consciousness shifted pretty rapidly and very quickly over the last 40, 50 years. And the overwhelming cultural message young women receive now is that is no longer true. That marriage is not your option to live a good life.
Are they
even
told
if,
that?
Even if it might be true.
Are they told that explicitly, that marriage is no longer the?
More or less. I mean, feminism took many turns and however many waves. I can't keep up. But the point is I think the impact on the consciousness of the, you know, the middle to upper middle class female is huge. And in
terms of pursuing career over marriage.
Yeah, absolutely. In terms of being able to define yourself outside of your domesticity.
So going back to what I said earlier about not being able to understand how young women are behaving, I don't think you can do this with men. I don't think you can coax them into doing one. I think you really have to like hit them over the head with it, incentivize it, and punish the opposite behavior. And nothing short of that will get men doing whatever it is you want them to do or whatever it is they want to do.
But what do you think women should be doing is my question. I think that's what.
I don't think there's an awareness among young women that how they're going to feel at 30 is different from how they're going to feel at 20.
I think that's true. I agree.
But that's what I find so complex. Or sorry, not complex.
But how much is your
perplexing?
How much do you mature between 20 and 30?
A ton.
Right. And your self-awareness hopefully increases and you are dating a lot more. I'm not to make this, to make the personal apply to the whole, but in my experience from 20 to 30, I absolutely wasted time dating the wrong men. I absolutely took for granted the time I had to date the right person.
And you've met someone, but you easily could not have met
I met someone at 30.
Yeah.
I'm 31 now, and I easily could not have.
Right. Or you could have met him at 33 or 34, and then there's still an opportunity cost there, even though you ended up meeting the right guy.
100%. But at 20, my aspirations for myself were absolutely oriented towards finding the thing that I was going to do with my life. And I took for granted kids and a husband would be part of that.
But you just proved my point.
No, but
you quite literally just made my point for me. Which is what I said.
No, but I'm trying to point out to you that the initial pursuit, the conscious pursuit of education and career for me was driven by work and self-defining first.
Yes.
Marriage and family after. That's not the case for...
you put it after because you said you took it for granted. You didn't imagine there was a scenario where it couldn't happen.
Betty Draper was not conditioned to take that for granted. She went after it. Like the misses finishing schools because the priority was family formation. I'm talking about what incentivizes us to pursue education and career as women. Do you see what I'm saying?
Not sure that I do. I can tell you, for example, and here's more minefield territory. 10 years after graduating med school, something like 90% of female MDs are working part-time hours. So
you just made a face.
Yeah, I made a face. The value to society.
That's staggering to you.
We heavily subsidize medical education for the obvious reason that doctors are good and more doctors are better. But the value of a female doctor, if 10 years after you give her a diploma, she's working part-time, is not the same as the value of a male doctor. If 10 years after you give him his diploma, he's still working full-time. We're just so like, if I said that, you'd fire me from every job. You'd never hire me. My name would be all over Twitter for a day if I had any
canceled.
I'd be canceled. But this is a very, very expensive thing for society to do in the name of women's empowerment. It literally does mean fewer doctors. You think your hospitals are underserved right now? There's a potential reason right there. They're taking up spots potentially from men who would not be working part-time 10 years later.
So is a solution to that to say, well, women can't pursue this path?
No.
Why not?
I don't think you have to. It's funny. Every time I bring this up, that's the first thing that.
Well, that's an obvious question to ask. Right.
But it's also, I don't think it entails restricting freedoms. I don't think you need to do that.
Okay.
But if you could be aware of it, that would be
But what does that mean? Concretely, what does that mean to be aware?
It means you can't, like what a culture is supposed to do. And this is one of the reasons I kind of, it's supposed to help people navigate life. And we don't know what a post-Christian culture looks like. It basically looks like whatever fad is popular among the intelligentsia and the people who have control over the entertainment industry. They're going to propagate that as the ideal.
And what are they basing that off of?
Their own values, maximal freedom. They want maximal freedom for themselves
because they earn the highest money and they can have maximal freedom.
But also they're also intelligent people who are conscientious and with maximal freedom they can take maximal advantage of it. But most people are not so conscientious. A lot of people really need guidance. A lot of people aren't capable of projecting themselves 5 or 10 years into the future. And if they have nothing in their life that says, hey, you got to watch out for X, Y, or Z. Like grandparents do that.
Okay, so let's say we were mindful of it, like taking this example of female doctors. Let's say we were mindful of this as an issue.
Oh, you would drop any pretext that 50-50 representation in med school was an automatic good. Immediately you would drop that.
But then it brings me back to my question. So does that mean accepting less women? Are you then maybe upping your criteria for the women you do accept?
No, just getting rid of any kind of.
No, but it's an interesting debate. Like how far? Like what are the proposed solutions to that problem that would satisfy?
Well, the soft solution, which would entail not barring anyone from pursuing what they wanted to pursue, would be a cultural awareness that, hey, being a woman at 20 is different than being a woman at 30, and you need to have your ducks in order. You need to have things set up in a way that you can make that transition comfortably and with minimal trauma, let's say.
So right now, the women who are pursuing, I mean, by definition, if you're pursuing, I mean, I don't know if it's by definition, but chances are, you're a reasonably intelligent person and you're a high achiever and if you're going into med school, right? So we can agree that like male or female, this is, we want good doctors. It's not that I think of the example of Nanny, but I do, like our grandmother. So she wasn't allowed to become a brain surgeon, but what if she had been allowed? And what
society would have been better, would have benefited from her skills as a brain surgeon.
Because of her genius.
The trade-off for that would have been our mother would have had probably 3 fewer siblings and we would have 6 fewer cousins.
Right.
But as long as we keep it, I've wanted to say that I've had this conversation with these cousins who were very mad that she was barred from this. And in the back of my head, I thought, you wouldn't be around. You wouldn't be around.
We made the cutoff.
You wouldn't have made the cutoff. Yeah.
Yes. But so here's what's so interesting. This is where we get caught. Like, I have no idea if Nanny wanted to have 3 extra children.
No, and I'm certainly not advocating a Handmaid's Tale situation.
No, of course not.
You put a gun to their head and say you're going to have those damn kids.
We know that we're allowed to discuss these things.
Yes.
So this is like arousing anger and frustration in me having this conversation inherently, mainly because I do recognize how much time I wasted. Mainly because I was also, very unfairly given a double message, and as I think most women are growing up, but also because. So it's interesting that you thought when I said I took for granted that I would get married and have kids.
I think that's what most young women do. It's not that they don't want it. It's just
right.
they think
So
they can take it for granted.
that is a funny residual symptom of a pre-sexual revolution era, which is interesting to me.
It is, in my opinion.
Yeah, but the framing of it is so different. Finishing schools are deplorable. The idea that you would want to be married and have kids by the time you're 25 means, and I mean, I hear the judgment in my own peer group, and we're an educated peer group of, like, oh yeah, like, no, she doesn't work. So what's so funny is that trope of, oh, she works from 1950. That was terrible. Now it's like, oh, she doesn't work. She doesn't work. Yeah. We've completely reversed that. So that's what I'm trying to say when you talk about the incentive. Which is great, by the way, again, if we're talking about women from our but can you see the incentive to want to work, to pursue something outside of? And I also see the attraction of living on your own and of paying your own bills and of dating freely. Those are all being autonomous. And of being autonomous. But that's I know you're kind of saying that offhand. Like, what I'm trying to argue is, I think, not so subconsciously, for women, that is still a very, very, very new freedom. But one of my questions is, and I don't think we know how to do women have that kind of sense of history? And maybe they do. I mean, maybe it's cultural consciousness. How much of a sense of history do you need to have if what you've been absorbing since childhood is female liberation, the right to vote, and all of these things that it enabled you to have the freedom to make your own life, as men have had for a very long time, to a certain extent. I know we were just. But I'm trying to compare the functional equivalence. I'm comparing the functional equivalence. I'm mad when I hear that, because the people who do teach like 12-year-olds this. I'm trying to say what we were taught. That's but I'm addressing the teachers, the educators. Okay. Because that's exactly how they did phrase it. Like, you now have the freedoms men always had. You didn't die in a trench in the First World War. Like, what do you know? What do you know? No, I'm serious. Like, it actually really makes my blood boil when I hear, and I've heard, like, what do you know about the sacrifice? Like, do you know that the women's suffrage movement in Britain paused because of the First World War? Do you know that? Like, they literally did. They agreed with the government. Like, no, this takes precedence. Of course, we'll stop our. Well, you know that, but I don't think most people do. No, I know. These men have got to go die to defend the homeland before you can get your right to vote. Absolutely. Like, fuck. But and I completely agree with you. All I was trying to illustrate to you is what has been absorbed as a cultural message about women in comparison to men. And men. And you're exactly right when you say that it used to be, oh, she has to work, that's sad, and oh, she doesn't work, that's sad. And in that reversal, there's been a flip in consciousness. And now the things of which we are unaware is slowly eroding any possibility for long-term happiness in a family formation. And it's also giving... And that's it's advantaging wealthy, intelligent, well-educated people who benefit the most from all of these freedoms in every way. That group of people have every advantage. Like, there was no trade-off for them to this. It was maximal freedom, maximal education, maximal wealth, and minimal sacrifice. They got to pursue their interests as they wanted them. But that's not been the case. And I hate having this conversation. The people who are most passionate about this all have college degrees. They're all upper middle class or higher educated white people. They're all fine. But if they took a little walk outside their bubble and went into the places in their countries that are not fine, all of a sudden they would see some of the consequences of this. But and let's pause on this for a second. What's happening in dating and family formation and marriage is still happening to the upper middle class. The rise in single women at 30 is and fewer children too. Well, so I was going to say, because they're starting later and later. The ultimate trade-off and sacrifice for women, and while it may not be equal to fighting in a war or backbreaking labor, is possibly going to be foregoing having kids. Period. And that might not necessarily be by choice. But then it's not by choice. I don't know that it's a sacrifice. A sacrifice is a sacrifice to me. Like, you may not be aware of it, but if you wanted kids and you missed the boat. The graph of women's fertility plotted against their education levels is like a perfect illustration. Like, the more education they get, the more their fertility levels plummet. Which, and it's hard to. Is also just Well, it's impossible. It's biological aging. Of course. Yeah, it's very undeniably. But then you can't deny. You asked me before what I would do about these things. Like, it's like,
a possible solution might be to have an awareness of this at university and
in high school.
And no, of course, but I'm saying like instead of having university be a 4-year free for all, which is just like every, you work Monday through Friday and then Friday and Saturday you're at a frat getting drunk. Maybe you have a bit more, not the chaperone culture of the 1950s where you couldn't, bring someone over to your dorm, but like surely we could restore dating on campuses. Surely we could restore that. Like what if we made it a norm that you're most likely to meet the person you're going to marry young on university campus? And what if we made dating more serious? And
what would it take is there no way that is serious?
That's a separate conversation, but I'm asking you, because one of the ways, like, you can start a career at 35. You really can. Like it's not as easy, I guess. But you can't start your family at 40. So that being the case, why don't we have it a way such that, and there are plenty of women who already do this. There are women who like figure this out early on and they'll take the hit early in their career to have the kids early in their career. And then, by the time the kid's 5, they're back in the swing of things, if that's what they really want. But that would mandate having a much more serious culture than we currently have. Because what we have as a culture is almost just, it's farcical. It would
4-year mandate having a culture we once had.
No, I'm not. Well,
to a certain extent.
But I'm not suggesting.
No, I know you're not. But I think it's interesting. Again, that whole notion of throwing the baby out with the bathwater. What needed to improve, arguably, did for the most part for women. And now we've lost sight of the goals. In fact, like I admitted to you, I took them for granted. And if you and I agree that probably most women do, part of that taking for granted is having no awareness whatsoever that what actually has drastically changed is the amount of available eligible men.
Mm-hmm.
That's the X factor. Because I was ready at 28. I couldn't find a mate who was.
Yeah.
And 28 for me was like, 28, this feels good.
Yeah.
And yeah, how naive and also ultimately selfish and maybe self-centered, completely self-centered of me to assume that by the time I reached the age I was ready.
But people are self-centered. This isn't a fault of any one person.
No, of course. But I'm pointing out that it's just ironic to me that also we were a culture that took things more seriously, dating being one of them, but also in that pursuit of a partner that should be taken seriously, you are also taking yourself so much more seriously by necessity.
Mm-hmm.
You're not making the myriad of detours people now in their 20s. Like delayed onset adulthood was not a thing. You were much more sure of yourself and where you came from.
Your society has to get to a stunning level of wealth and luxury and comfort before delayed onset adulthood can be a thing. To me, that's like the perfect example of our own decadence, that we can have that as a symptom or a diagnosis of 20-somethings. I think a paradigm might be pre-1960, the culture tended to treat women as if they were only one aspect of their biology. And that was very limiting to them. And if I have a complaint about culture post-1960, it's a denial that there is a biological aspect to being a woman. It's this wishful thinking that you can just have the exact same life course men have, and that will end up making you fulfilled and happy. And both of those, in their own ways, are a denial of women's humanity.
And men's.
Yeah, but I suppose. This hasn't been good for men. I'm not trying to say it's been good for men. But it's so funny because theoretically, this is the feminist age. Like, has feminism ever had more influence on government or the economy or corporations? I don't think so. And I don't see that translating into women's life satisfaction. And I know we have data on this, so I'm confident saying that women's life satisfaction is at an all-time low and low relative to men. It used to be high relative to men. It's now low relative to men.
It's interesting too, though, because I think even the women who get, the educated upper middle class women who get so defensive, enraged even I think we'd be screamed at for saying half of what we just said,
Well,
are also the ones 10 years later who are reporting how unhappy they are.
Yeah. But at a certain point, there becomes a kind of like, you invested in this choice, so you have to you have to rationalize your choices.
Yeah, at 24, 25, 26, 27, 28, for as long as you're eligibly dateable, for as long as you are holding on to your biological attractiveness. And then suddenly you find yourself in your early 30s, you're still single, you're looking around, you're mad at men even more so because you can't find anyone you want to date or who's worthy of dating you according to your standards that are high, as they should be, because you're looking to settle down and partner. And then you become a statistic. You become part of the research that showcases women are reporting high levels of unhappiness in the workforce. And if you do settle down and have 2 kids, or even 1 kid, and this is astonishing to me now, I know most of my friends only have 1 kid, they're overwhelmed by it because they're working full-time jobs and they're miserable and they would much prefer to work part-time.
And to spend time with their children.
But their husbands aren't out
years.
earning them, so they don't feel that they can comfortably maintain mortgage payments while also working less.
We have data on women's own self-reported ideal work situation when they have children. And it is not, if you're a 1950s advocate or traditionalist, it's not to not work at all, but it is to work part-time. And it's not to work full-time. It's like, oh, they want to work. They want to have something outside the home that they're invested in.
They also want to be available to their child.
But they also want to be available to their child.
Because that becomes a biological urge and precedent, which women who don't have kids cannot comprehend.
And an emotional urge.
Yeah, but women who don't have kids yet can't understand that yet.
I've had terrible. Okay, maybe I just keep my mouth shut on this one.
No, tell me.
I've had so many friends in their 30s who get a dog, and the dog is their kid, and they'll throw it birthday parties. I'm not kidding. Like,
Brooklyn is filled with cat moms.
But that's a thing. And I watching how, like, I love pets and I love dogs, but like there's like a anthropomorphism going on with like women who are single and childless and their pets. It's worth pointing out, even if that's another thing that gets me canceled. The advantage to not being famous is you can't cancel me. Just a kook.
Can I read back something else that you wrote to me when we were in the midst of going back and forth?
This was a personal conversation we were having?
A personal
email exchange?
Yeah. Do you remember, like, we used to have like
lengthy ones?
Yeah. Basically mini novellas on how that was like in my,
This was post 2016.
I think this is even pre 2016, to be honest. This might be 2014, 2015. It might have been right after we saw like Don John with Joseph Gordon-Levitt, and we had a big debate over it. But I'm quoting you here just because when we were having this exchange, I was still clinging on to all of my feminist notions about how I was living my life while I was also single and very unhappy in dating. And I forget the context entirely, but I copy pasted this. This is what you wrote. I wish I had the kind of power that they attribute to the patriarchy. I would gladly wave my hand and change seats with them. Give women 90% of Congress and the Senate and the Parliament. Give them all the Fortune 500 positions. Take the vote away from men. But in exchange, they do all the harvesting of the food, the mining of natural resources, the construction of buildings and maintenance of city infrastructure, in the rain and in the freezing cold. Women can also fight and die in wars to protect the motherland, and we men will keep home. And then see how it feels to be told that you've had it so good that you are the oppressor. And then you wrote, I have the most keen feeling of schadenfreude, Chris. I want to pity those women who want to stay home, who want to be mothers. I want to lament their difficulty in finding a suitable partner or having a child. But this is what women have been asking for, voting for 50 years. And it's only right they get to live with the consequences of their ideology too.
That sounds horribly harsh. I was probably in a bad place. I don't think I'm wrong, but it sounds harsh.
No, but first of all, if you don't think you're wrong,
I don't.
Then it doesn't sound harsh.
It does sound harsh to me.
Why?
I don't know.
It sounds passionate to me. And it also, now rereading it through my 31-year-old lens, it is so painfully true. Your feeling of schadenfreude, that is exactly what this is.
Mm.
And I read it out loud because I think it needs to be harsh. I think we need to be a little bit more harsh when we discuss these issues in society. Come get us, cancel culture.
Mulling that over.
What are you mulling? What aspects of it are you mulling over?
What I just said and what you said in response. That is what freedom means. If you want absolute freedom, and they keep that seems to be the goal of wherever we're headed. It's the maximal freedom, but that also means you have no one to blame.
But it also means, and this is very tricky territory, specifically right now in this moment in 2020, and what we're watching unravel in the US. There are consequences to every ideology. Mm-hmm. You can virtue signal all you want. Your morally righteous ground will remain untainted, but there will be consequences to your ideological underpinnings and your ideologically driven actions. And that is what I have learned in my 10 years from 20 to 30.
One of the saddest survey data I've seen from the States, it asked people what they thought their society valued and then to rank order those things. So it was like career accomplishment, wealth, children, happy marriage, maybe fame was one of them. And then it asked them, what do you personally value? And when people were asked to rank order what they thought their society valued, wealth, accomplishment, and I think fame were the top three. And then family was like 4 or 5. And then when it was asked, what do you personally value? Family was number 1. And that's just like that. If I can find it, I'm sure that study, and let's say that there may be flaws with it, and maybe it's not perfectly representative, but it doesn't seem to me so far out of whack with where we are as a culture. And I have no trouble whatsoever believing that family is still that important to people, because that's I don't think we cease being human, no matter how much wealth we attain or how much freedom. The people who matter most to me tend to be either family or friends that have been friends so long that they're basically family. And I think that's true of most people. And I think we could dispense with a lot of the wealth and a lot of the status and still be very happy if we maintain the family. And I think conversely, if we lose the family, no amount of wealth, no amount of status will make up for that. And that's the tragedy of our generation, is that that's exactly what's happening.
You took the words out of my mouth.
Sorry. I think it's worth reiterating, because I don't think there's enough compassion about this, that for a young man looking to find a serious romantic relationship, his career is a tool to him. And if he doesn't have that in order, his chances are dramatically worsened. And that's not an argument to take away careers from women or to prohibit women from doing careers, but to be blind to this fact of basic biology might be fatal for our culture, for our societies, and certainly is fatal for these young men, because they just decide fuck it and play video games or shoot up some fentanyl.
I think it's also interesting to point out there are so many people who cannot stand Jordan Peterson or even seek to understand why so many young men are drawn to him and his 12 rules for life. Mm-hmm. But so much of what resonates, I think, with young men about what Jordan Peterson says relates very specifically to tying your sense of self-worth to what you do.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I think that's it's so basic. That's true for just about everyone, but especially true for men, and young men at that, especially right now in our culture it's a dumpster fire right now, but I think it's so funny to me that no one is remotely curious as to why so many young men in droves and thousands show up.
Yeah.
And millions listen to him. And then the testimonies, when I read them, I was like rereading them today, like millions of testimonies and just comments on thanking him for just giving them some kind of guidepost on how to navigate not just their life, but also like how to create benchmarks for themselves in terms of what defines success. And I guess, I don't know how you put it in masculine terms, but self-worth as a man. And there's a direct correlation to what he says and workforce participation. Get out there, make your bed and get out there. I don't know. I just thought that was interesting. I think that is interesting. I think that's a cultural phenomenon that's taking place, and people are either ignoring it, dismissing it, or valuing how significant it is for men to hear that message, and how they're responding to it should be something we're all applauding. And we're not. I think we're afraid of it.
I think that's true.